Hi, it's Cynthia from Sin City NeuroNP. So today I just wanted to talk about psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, which is not to be confused with malingering or factitious disorder. Malingering is when you fake seizures to get something. Maybe you want to stay in the hospital. Maybe you want to get out of jail, need a place to stay, get out of work. That's malingering. Factitious disorder, formerly known as Munchausen's, is when you basically pretend to be sick or even make yourself sick for attention. So PNES, or that, like I said, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, are not those. So often I'll hear nurses or physicians say, oh, this patient is faking their seizures, and maybe they're malingering, maybe it's factitious, but when we're saying that somebody has psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, that is not fake. So it's commonly associated with sexual abuse, childhood, and also PTSD. And it is a maladaptive behavior, an emotional response to a stressor where you start to convulse. It is not within that person's control. So just like when you're crying or you're upset and you have that, you can't control it, or become very angry, those are emotional responses to some sort of stressor. And in the same way that is your response with PNES, the patient, they will convulse. They have no control over it. And it's quite dangerous in the fact that wherever it happens is where it happens. So they can fall and hurt themselves, get into a car accident. And so a lot of times, even though it is not epileptic, we do put them under the same restrictions as I would for an epileptic, because I really don't necessarily want them driving, or doing anything dangerous, swimming by themselves, climbing onto tall ladders. They would be under those same types of restrictions. But in their case, seizure medications don't work. And oftentimes they are on seizure medications and they're just not effective because they're not having epileptic seizures. Now, let's say a patient came into the hospital and we did the EEG, they're having pseudo seizures, and we find that there's no epileptic activity on EEG, and we diagnose them with PNES. Now, will I necessarily stop all their seizure medications? Not necessarily, because they could maybe have an underlying epilepsy. Perhaps their outpatient neurologist showed an epileptic seizure on EEG, and that's why they started their medications to begin with. So I don't necessarily want to stop their medications, but I will not increase them, and I will not start any new ones. And I would have them follow up with that diagnosis in hand, because perhaps their outpatient neurologist as well had never actually picked one up. The treatment for this is cognitive behavioral therapy. So basically trying to, create new ways to manage stress. Because a lot of times when these people, when these patients are developing, what happens is they aren't able to express themselves in a manner, or maybe during their childhood, they didn't have the ability to develop proper coping mechanisms. Let's say they had parents and they were like, no, you can't cry, no crying, no getting angry, none of this. And so they've had to bottle this up, and they still have to have an emotional response to things. So now their body does this. So in these cases, they would still need to follow up with their neurologist, maybe to be tapered off their medications, because you don't want them on medications that have a bunch of side effects. And nothing in here is medical advice. So if you do have PNES, do not stop your medications unless your outpatient neurologist told you to. And in general, just, be supportive, and just be there for your patients. And it's very important for them to trust you. Okay, so that's kind of my thing with PNES.